Hi, everyone. So, I want to start my lectures on George Orwell here with a reading of a poem by one of his contemporaries, the poet W.H. Auden, called The Shield of Achilles. Now, if you're not familiar with, if you've had class with me, I've probably brought up at some point either uh, of Homer's two books, but it's a 3,000-year-old poem called the Iliad, one of the most foundational texts in Western literature. The other book being the Odyssey. Those two are by tradition, a person named Homer or Omeros. And in the Iliad, which is the first of the two, it features a character named Achilles. You probably heard of Achilles. It's made its way into the English language with Achilles' heel, etc. You probably know that he was pierced by an arrow through the back of his heel, which is where we get the term Achilles tendon. Anyway, so in the story, Achilles is basically the most skilled fighter on the planet, right? He at one point almost kills a god when he becomes enraged. And at one point, his armor is stolen. And so his mother, Thetis, who's a goddess, she goes and has new armor made for him. And this is a very famous part of that book in the Iliad, where Hephaestus, the armor god, crafts this shield upon which he puts this kind of whole panoply of um, human civilization, human history, etc. And um, the way it's described in the original text is how a god would see humanity. I mean, it's literally the Greek gods don't care about human beings whatsoever. We're just playthings for them. And so Hephaestus, who is kind of he's ugly, he's brutish, he's crippled, but still immortal, right? Is still looking down upon human beings. So this is the she when she looked over, and what Auden does in this poem is this is each stanza. These are stanzas here. Each stanza is moving back and forth between the interaction between Thetis and Hephaestus, and then the description of the shield. So it kind of moves between the gods and then us. Okay. So that's the tonal differentiation. You'll hear it as I read it. Also, I'm using Auden here in relationship to Orwell. If you know the attacks that George Orwell made upon Auden, which were highly unfair. But anyway, so this is a little bit of recompense for Wystan Hugh Auden. The Shield of Achilles. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble, well-governed cities, and ships upon untamed seas. But there, on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat, and nowhere to sit down, yet congregated on its blankness stood an unintelligible multitude, a million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones as dry and level as the place. No one was cheered, and nothing was discussed. Column by column, in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower-garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there, on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed an arbitrary spot where bored officials lounged. One cracked a joke, and sentries sweated, for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary decent folk watched from without, and neither moved nor spoke, as three pale figures were led forth and bound to 3 posts driven upright in the ground. The mass and majesty of this world, all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs, quick to music. But there, on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that 2 boys knife a third, were axioms to him, who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armorer, Hephaestus, hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought, to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. Now, it's this part right here. I mean, this stanza always gets me, that line, where one could weep because another wept. It's this part right here, where these people are driven out and bound. And it's this idea of dying as men or humans before their bodies died, that human beings are especially cruel in how we treat one another. And it's this idea of shame, this idea of pride or dignity being stripped away from somebody. And it's almost as if in conversation with a story by Orwell that we're going to read called A Hanging, in which the main character, being a very young George Orwell, doesn't happen to notice the humanity of this person that's about to be executed until this one epiphany, this one moment in the story. So what does it mean to die as a human before their bodies died? It's this sense, and I think Orwell is very sensitive to this, the impact of language on how we conduct ourselves in the world toward each other as human beings. So you might have heard of George Orwell before. There's a picture of him. I don't know exactly when that would be. Probably around 40-ish. He was born Eric Blair. That's his real name. In India. His father was part of the colonial or imperial police, I believe. And he was born in 1903, died in 1950. So lived through World War II. Was I forget the name of it, but it was part of like the civilian service in Britain during World War II. He had very poor health for most of his life. His lungs were very bad, and he was a heavy smoker. So don't smoke. So he's a British or English author, journalist, and essayist. He's probably most known for 2 books, which are 1984 and Animal Farm. If most people have probably come across Animal Farm, and most people should have heard of the book 1984 for its outsized influence on thought, the English language, etc. He wrote actually quite a few books. His first book was Burmese Days, A Clergyman's Daughter, not that good. Coming Up for Air, Down and Out in Paris and London, pretty good. Homage to Catalonia, which is really good. Keep the Apodistra Flying, I've never read that. And The Road to Wigan Pier, which is a really scathing book about the working class in Britain. Orwell was very sensitive to people who were without power, and he wanted to understand why that was, like why or how does one support a system that disadvantages so many? And you can hear in him a little bit of leaning toward socialism. He called himself a democratic socialist, as differentiated from communism. Anyway, as I said, his influence on the world is outsized, considering that he lived to be, I think, 46, 47. His name itself, his pen name, has entered the English language. We call Orwellian, we say that this government, or that's an Orwellian institution, because of what he described, the government that he used in his book, 1984. And it's similar in a way to that of the Czechoslovakian author who wrote in German, Franz Kafka. We say that things are Kafka-esque when we're describing something like a very Baroque bureaucracy, or something that's so ironic that it bends upon itself, right? We call it Kafkaesque. Some of the other words that we use nowadays in English that come from Orwell would be something like Big Brother. That's directly from 1984. The Thought Police, 1984. Newspeak, Thought Crimes. All of these come from his book, 1984. I might do a short talk on it because it's such an important book. But I want to focus more on his essays, which I think are really his best work. I love 1984. Animal Farm is brilliant. As I said, Road to Wigan Pier is really, really good. Burmese Days is interesting. Down and Out in Paris Alone is a lot of fun. But his essays are where he spent most of his time writing. Just to kind of show you this, I have here. So these are the collected essays, journalism, and letters. They're not all here. I think this collection came out in the 60s, I think. I'm guessing. 68. And so they didn't have access to all of his essays, but his essays are really, really good. And so for this class, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be reading A Hanging, very early essay, an essay called Shooting an Elephant. We're going to read excerpts from Politics in the English Language. We're going to read You and the Atomic Bomb, and then maybe an essay called Marrakech, and maybe one other. These are going to be the foci of your midterm and final for this semester. So, yeah, that will be our little introduction. So think back to Auden's poem. In what way, right? In what way do these people die as people before their bodies die? Is because of we have removed that category by torturing them, by demeaning them, by dehumanizing them. We have removed that category of human from the way we describe those people. So Orwell was very, very focused on ways that language influences how we see each other, and ways that it can be manipulated to dehumanize other groups, other people, in a way that we then don't feel bad about mistreating them or thinking negatively about them. So, yeah. So I'm not going to go through and edit these. There'll just be like jump cuts in between sections when I have to pause for various reasons. So I want to look at his essay from 1945 called You and the Atom Bomb. Now, this was written and published, not terribly long after the U.S. Dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan to bring an end to World War II. Now, for us, living with atomic weapons for as long as we have, our entire lives, this is not paradigmatic. This is not a big change for us to think about because, atomic weapons have always been around. But you really can't put yourself in the mindset of somebody from that time period easily, because for them, a bomb is something very local. You can go look at footage from the Marshall Islands, the Bikini Atoll, where they were testing nuclear weapons. I mean, the scale of early nuclear weapons is immense, and now we have ones that are hundreds, thousands of times more powerful. City ending. Millions of people just wiped out like that. So it's a mindset that you have to get into to try to understand what Orwell is doing, let alone what people are doing or thinking back then. We have these bombs that can just wipe, in their mind, wipe out civilization. So if we look at his essay, this is a very useful channel, or website, the Orwell Foundation. Part of your, you've probably already done it. Part of your MLA APA citation exercise was based around this, because this is the site I want you to use for all of your online citations when you're referencing Orwell. Well, in this, he talks in this paragraph right here. This is fairly early on into the essay, where he says, I'll make it a little bigger. It is a commonplace that the history of civilization is largely the history of weapons. Okay. In particular, the connection between the discovery of gunpowder and the overthrow of feudalism by the bourgeoisie has been pointed out over and over again. The gunpowder was a transformational invention. It had been around for a very long time, but not weaponized to the same degree that we saw in Europe, largely due to their ability to refine metal, refine steel, and or iron and then steel. And it ended feudalism. I mean, you have to think like all the knights, the armors suddenly becomes completely irrelevant. The same thing happened in Japan with the their feudal period as well. When you saw the samurai, right, transitioning into this new period, because you could hand any poor peasant a musket, and they could be trained in a day to fire it. And all of a sudden, all of that training with the swords and all of that expensive armor, irrelevant. Okay? And though I have no doubt exceptions can be brought forward, I think the following rule would be found generally true. That ages in which the dominant weapon is expensive or difficult to make will tend to be ages of despotism, whereas when the dominant weapon is cheap and simple, the common people have a chance. Thus, for example, tanks, battleships, and bombing planes are inherently tyrannical weapons, while rifles, muskets, longbows, and hand grenades are inherently democratic weapons. I want you to think of this tyrannical or despotic versus democratic weapons. Okay, we're going to start to lean this idea toward how language itself can be used as a weapon. This is a very strong point that Orwell makes in many of his books, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. We're starting to think now metaphorically, not as a weapon per se of, chop, chop, bang, bang, but rather thinking of words as weapons, okay, and how those affect human lives. A complex weapon makes the strong stronger, while a simple weapon, so long as there is no answer to it, gives claws to the weak. What's interesting about this is that this is written, like I said, in 1945, back when the U.S. and the Russians, the Soviets, were still friends. As if you could be friends with somebody like Joseph Stalin. Now, what's interesting about this essay, and I've read this elsewhere, is that, let me see if I can find it. One moment. Right here. Burnham's theory, you don't need to know who James Burnham is, has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. As far as we know, Orwell coined the term Cold War. So that period of mutually assured destruction between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where each had a nuclear stockpile, and they said, if you try to blow us up, we will blow you up too. So mutually assured destruction created this Cold War. They can't go to war directly, okay? And so that is what he's referring to there. So it's interesting. So Orwell kind of creates all of these different terms and phrases. Now that's a period of resulting stagnation. So like I said, that mutually assured destruction results from these nuclear weapons as tyrannical weapons, right? As despotic weapons, because they're wildly expensive to create. It's prohibitive. In fact, Orwell makes a joke about this, that luckily they are hard to make. Otherwise, people be blowing themselves up all over the place. So what happens is that in each, let's say America and Soviet Union, there's an escalation, and this escalation is an us versus them kind of escalation. And I can remember even from my childhood, the Soviet Union basically fell in '89, give or take, 91, somewhere in there. And I can remember, as a kid, the Soviet Union being discussed, and then I remember, the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of this. It was a very interesting thing to witness. This idea that democracy or capitalism has won. But this us versus them was very much from the 50s up through the almost to the 90s, 40, 50 years, was a very high tension point. Now, this is, for Orwell, what happens with overt nationalism, where we value our countries over anything because of this us versus them dynamic. Now, Orwell did, in a sense, very much love England, of course. I mean, we can't help where we're born. But he wanted to, in good Socratic fashion, for those of you who have read a little bit of Socrates in Plato, we have to interrogate or ask questions of the things, even the things that we value the most. So it's not just, why don't I like this, but why do I like this? Why am I proud to be blah, 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 blah? Why do I think democracy is? Why do I think UB is the greatest university in the Bahamas? Anyway, so he wanted to remind us that simply loving one's country, an institution, etc., is not enough in a liberal democracy. For Orwell, he wants to question and challenge everything around him. And so this idea of these democratic weapons, I think, is a really good interrogation of, who's in control, who wields power, and how is that maintained. So we got through that. So anyway, I'm going to pause and then we'll be back in a moment. Okay, so I'd like to make these videos about 30 minutes long each, so they're more digestible. So I got about 7 minutes to talk here. The idea that I want you to really start thinking about is this idea of language and who's in control of it. Okay, when we look at the next essay that we're going to look at from Orwell, which is Politics in the English Language, we'll see a much more focused approach. It's an earlier essay, but it's still very important. The idea that I want you to think about is this question here. Is language democratic? Because we all speak language. Humans can't help but speak a language. Our brains are pretty much geared toward language comprehension, language use. If you speak more than one language, if you're a polyglot, you'll know that sometimes the words don't exactly translate between languages. It's a fascinating enterprise. So if you are familiar with these names, then you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, it's university. I get to throw ideas at you and stuff you haven't heard. So, but these two characters here, Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault. Nietzsche was a German philosopher. Foucault was a French historian, not a philosopher. Let me make that clear. Now, they saw history as a genealogy of definition. So they were largely language-based in their approach to how they saw philosophy, history, etc. So these shifting definitions, by genealogy here we would mean like the history, the etymology of a word. Okay, all words have come from preceding languages. I was just talking about this with a student because she said that for summer she was going to Eleuthera, and I showed it because I have a Greek dictionary upstairs, and I showed her the etymology, the definition of eleutheria in Greek just means freedom. Okay, and so our words today, even the one of the family islands, right, has this tradition. So in English, for example, a lot of our animal words come from German or Germanic languages like Anglo-Saxon. Other words like metropolis, right, come from Greek. A lot of our words come from... Anyway, so words, very important. So is history merely this series of definitions that change over time, right? How do we define X, whatever that is, today versus 100 years ago? Like, what do we call, how do we define freedom today versus 200 years ago, right? Freedom for whom, etc. Now, Foucault was homosexual, and he explored the ways in some of his books that homosexuality was discussed throughout history. Now, I don't particularly care for Foucault for philosophical reasons. I don't like what he does necessarily with language, but I think he's a very interesting character, especially in today's cultural landscape. So, for example, homosexuality used to be seen as a mental illness. And it was classified as a mental illness, whereas today we don't think of it as it's just who you are, like who cares. But so what he's trying to do is kind of interrogate, right, history or morality even through its association with terminology, with language. How do we label this? How do we label that? Okay, this is effectively a form of linguistic relativism, what we call linguistic relativism, which would say that there is no capital T truth out there to be found, just small historically contingent truths. Okay, what's true today may not be true tomorrow. Now, we're starting to see, hopefully, that language, though we share it, may not be democratic, right? Who gets to set the definitions of what is, for example, a mental illness or not? What is legal or not, right? And this is something that is still ongoing. For example, in America, I think it's been a while, almost 20 years now, gay marriage is legal. It's not in Bahamas or South Korea. So gay people are not allowed that legal right, because that category, what we label them as, alters their legal standing. So you see, this is something that's still very relevant today. Now, are there things that you are not allowed to say? Like, who polices that? These are big problems that Orwell is definitely concerned with. Okay, even 80 years ago. Okay, today we could say that in modern society this has become weaponized. Things that you are not allowed to say because of who you are. Everybody is very quick to label things at people as racist, homophobic. Oops. Oh, come on. This whiteboard. Sorry, I just caught that typo. Homophobic, transphobic, sexist, etc. Simply, if you bring up an issue, and you all know this, right, through social media, right? Cancel culture. Orwell would have been horrified by that because he saw the free exchange of ideas, even criticism, as necessary in a democratic society. So who is policing that language, right? Who is allowed to criticize, to speak up, to say anything, right? These become very important. The more you erode that, the less democratic a culture that you have. He would have also been horrified. I'm horrified by it. The way people video their own lives, right? They're going around live streaming themselves and sharing this, right, with the world. The idea of public and private have been eroded so badly that some people can't distinguish them, right? And if you go read 1984, one of the major themes in that book is the issue of personal privacy, the ability to hold one's own thoughts, beliefs, feelings as your own, right? That privacy of your convictions was really, really important for the main character, Winston Smith. So in postmodern terminology, this is nothing that we have to worry about too much. If this were a class for my English majors, I would be going much more into this. But in postmodern terminology, right, since language is always changing and shifting, like Nietzsche and Foucault were talking about, there is no fixed truth that we can appeal to. Okay. Now, if you had 119 with me, and I think some of you probably have, think back to Plato's Republic, when we saw Socrates walking around in Athens. He was constantly doing what? This character Socrates was a Greek philosopher, kind of considered the first major philosophical character because of his importance and because of Plato, his student. Socrates would wander around Athens constantly asking, what is X? When you say this, when you say courage, when you say love, when you say beauty, what do you mean? And the other person would give him an answer, and then Socrates would ask questions and back and forth. And what he's trying to do is create a dialectic in which both characters, right, come to a better understanding of what that term is. Okay, that's dialectic. That's the basic, what's called the elenchus in the Greek. So I ask you, like, oh, so you like that kind of thing? Oh, tell me about it. Why do you like that? And then I say, well, I like this kind of thing. And now we both have a better understanding of not only each other, but that thing itself. Okay, so definitions still important today, right? What does it mean to be free, right? Are we, as people who luckily live in democratic societies, are we free? What are we free to do? Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be human? How do we define a human being? To possess rights. When we say I have rights, I have human or civic rights, what does that mean? Right? So these terms are really, really important, and not just from a pedantic point of view, but rather because we use language so much in our day-to-day lives, these definitions become super important. For example, until the UK in 1807, I think, in the US, we fought a civil war over it, effectively ended slavery between 160 and 200 years ago. Slavery was a human universal. It wasn't like white people, black people. It was everybody was enslaving everybody else when they could. And this goes back as far into human history, unfortunately, as we can see. Now, were those people different? Like when we think of slavery, right? Were those people different? No, they're still human beings, right? But how were they being described, right? What were they being called? Were they being dehumanized? Because the moment we can create that us-them category through language, right? It's hard to do without language. If I see a person over there, it's like, okay, person, right? But if I see, Soviet person, right, during the Cold War, I'm a democratic person. I say, there's a communist over there. I'm starting to categorize them through language, and that effectively distances their humanity from my own. I think we can start to see that language, and this is Orwell's point, language is not a democratic thing. It's not a democratic weapon, right? Everybody can use it, but there are certain gatekeepers, there are certain methods of controlling language to make it tyrannical, right? To make it into this us versus them dynamic. Now, Orwell would not agree with that postmodern view that there is no truth to be had. Orwell would say that truth is hard to locate, absolutely. It may take a long time, but we have to continue working toward it. And for Orwell, he would genuinely say that the only place where we can freely interrogate this is in a democratic country. Okay? So in the next lecture, I'm going to turn to a discussion of politics and the English language. And I want you to think back to that, where we started this lecture, with Auden, right? Those people who died as men before their bodies died, right? They were stripped of their dignity, right? In that case, through torture, in that case, through the public spectacle of this public execution. Orwell would agree with that, but he would also say that language itself can do this, can kill people as people before the physical body dies. So, English politics and the English language coming up next.